I was raised in the shadows of Thornfield Manor, a child who belonged to no one and yet was permitted to exist within its walls like a ghost given breath. For 22 years, I moved through those corridors with the quietness of someone who understood that her presence was a kindness extended, never a right earned. My earliest memories are of stillness. The rustle of my governess's skirts as she led me through the east wing to the schoolroom. The scent of beeswax and old leather in the library where I was allowed to read but never to linger. The cold smoothness of the marble floors beneath my slippered feet. I learned early that silence was my currency, gratitude my only acceptable expression. When the family dined, I ate in the nursery long past the age when other girls had joined their parents at table. When they entertained, I watched from the gallery above, my small hands gripping the balustrade as I studied the glittering world below, a world I could observe but never enter. I was told my mother had been a seamstress who died bringing me into the world, that my father was unknown, and that Lady Thornfield, in her Christian mercy, had taken me in rather than see me cast into an orphanage. I accepted this story the way I accepted the weather, as an unchangeable truth around which my life must arrange itself. I was grateful. I was obedient. I asked no questions. The manor itself became my universe, vast and largely indifferent. I knew every creaking board in the servants' stairs, every corner where the afternoon light fell warmest, every portrait that lined the long gallery. I studied the faces of the Thornfield ancestors, those stern men and pale women in their elaborate frames, and wondered if they would have approved of my presence or found it an affront. Sometimes I imagined they watched me as I passed, judging whether I had earned another day under their roof. Lady Thornfield was not unkind, which I suppose is its own form of kindness. She ensured I was fed, clothed, educated. She hired governesses who taught me French, music, watercolors, all the accomplishments deemed necessary for a young woman, though to what end I could not fathom. She never struck me or raised her voice, but neither did she touch me with affection or speak to me of anything beyond the most practical concerns. I was a task she had undertaken, executed with the same cool competence she brought to managing her household accounts. I learned to read her moods in the set of her shoulders, the way she held her teacup, the particular silence that fell when I entered a room. I learned that my greatest virtue was to make myself useful without making myself noticed. I became skilled at anticipating needs, at fading into wallpaper when my presence was inconvenient, at offering small services that might earn a nod of acknowledgement. I fetched her spectacles, wound her embroidery silks, read aloud when her eyes tired. In this way, I earned my place, day by day, hour by hour. The other servants were kind in their fashion, but there was always a distance. I was neither family nor truly one of them. Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, called me Miss Catherine, but treated me more like an upper housemaid, giving me small tasks to occupy my time. I helped inventory the linen, arranged flowers, catalogued books. I was useful. I was quiet. I existed in the spaces between things. I had no friends my own age. The village girls who came to work in the kitchens or laundry were wary of me, uncertain of my status, and I lacked the confidence to bridge that gap. The daughters of neighboring estates were introduced to me at church, but the introductions never led to calls or invitations. I suspect their mothers had been informed of my uncertain origins. I learned to endure these small rejections with composure, to keep my face smooth and my eyes downcast, to murmur polite nothings and retreat as soon as decency allowed. My one rebellion, if it could be called that, was my reading. The library at Thornfield was extensive, built up over generations and largely ignored by the current family. I read everything I could reach, climbing the wheeled ladder to access the highest shelves, losing myself in novels and histories and books of poetry. I read by candlelight in my small room under the eaves, by the window seat in the library on rainy afternoons, in the garden when the weather permitted. The heroines in my novels had tragic pasts and mysterious parentage, and they were always claimed in the end by some revelation, some twist of fate that proved them worthy of love and station. I knew these were only stories, but they gave me a kind of comfort, a sense that perhaps there might be more to my life than this endless, careful gratitude. I was 22 that autumn when everything changed, though I did not recognize the change at first. It began with a letter delivered one morning in October, carried up the drive by a boy from the village. I was in the morning room helping Lady Thornfield sort through her correspondence when she opened it, and I saw her face go still in a way I had learned to interpret as significant emotion held rigidly in check. "Your son writes that he will be returning home within the fortnight," I heard her say to Lord Thornfield, though her voice was so carefully neutral it might have been reporting the weather. I did not understand the undercurrent in the room until later, when Mrs. Hartley explained to me in a hushed voice that the eldest son, Captain James Thornfield, had been away at war for 5 years and was coming home at last. I had only the dimmest memories of Captain Thornfield. He had left for the army when I was 17, and I had seen him perhaps a dozen times in my life, always at a distance. He had been a figure of no particular importance to me, one more member of the family whose lives touched mine only tangentially. I remembered him as tall, dark-haired, with something restless in his bearing even then, as though the manor could not quite contain him. The household erupted into frenzied preparation. Rooms that had been closed for years were aired and cleaned. The best silver was brought out and polished. Mrs. Hartley directed the staff with the intensity of a general marshalling troops. I helped where I could, carrying linens, arranging flowers, trying to stay out of the way while still making myself useful. Lady Thornfield moved through it all with her usual composure, but I noticed she touched the locket at her throat more frequently. A gesture I had learned signaled anxiety beneath her controlled exterior. He arrived on a gray afternoon, when the wind carried the scent of rain and rotting leaves. I was in the garden cutting late roses for the dinner table when I heard the carriage wheels on the gravel drive. I set down my basket and moved toward the house, drawn by curiosity I could not quite suppress. I told myself I would only glance from the window, that it was not my place to witness the reunion. But something in me needed to see this stranger who had sent such ripples of anticipation through the house. I reached the side entrance just as he was stepping down from the carriage. He was changed from the young man I dimly remembered. War had carved something harder into his features, drawn lines around his eyes and mouth. He wore civilian clothes, but carried himself with military precision, his shoulders straight, his movements economical. He looked up at the house with an expression I could not read, something between relief and resignation, and for just a moment, before he saw his mother approaching, I glimpsed something raw and weary in his face. Then Lady Thornfield was there, and he bent to kiss her cheek with formal affection. I should have moved away then, returned to my flowers, but I remained frozen at the window, watching as they exchanged words I could not hear. And then, as though he sensed my presence, he turned and looked directly at me. Our eyes met across the distance, and I felt something shift in my chest, a sensation like falling though my feet were planted firmly on the floor. His gaze was dark, intense, searching in a way that made me feel suddenly visible in a way I had never been before. For a long moment, neither of us looked away, and I felt heat rise to my cheeks even as some instinct told me I should retreat, should lower my eyes, should remember my place. It was he who looked away first, turning back to his mother, but not before I saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or curiosity. I could not tell. I fled to the kitchen, my heart beating harder than the encounter warranted, my hands shaking slightly as I arranged the roses in their vase. Mrs. Hartley noticed my flushed face and asked if I was unwell, and I lied and said I had been hurrying. She accepted this with a nod and sent me to help prepare the tea tray. That evening, the family dined together, and I ate in my room as always. But I could not stop thinking about that moment, that look. It meant nothing, I told myself. He had simply noticed someone at the window, nothing more. And yet I found myself unable to settle, pacing my small room, touching the books on my shelf without opening them, staring out at the darkening garden. I did not see him again for 3 days. The household revolved around his presence, adjusting to accommodate him. But I continued in my usual routines, keeping to the edges of things. I told myself it was better this way, that it would be foolish to imagine his return had anything to do with me. I was what I had always been, a shadow permitted to exist on the margins of this family, and his homecoming changed nothing about my place in the world. But on the 4th day, I encountered him in the library. I had gone there in the early morning, believing the family would still be at breakfast, seeking the solace of books as I always had. I was reaching for a volume of poetry on the higher shelf when I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find him standing in the doorway, watching me. I froze on the ladder, my hand still extended toward the book, feeling acutely aware of how I must look, caught in the act of stealing time in a room where I had no real right to be. "I did not mean to intrude," I said, beginning to descend. "I can return later." He raised a hand to stop me. "Please," he said, and his voice was lower than I expected, roughened perhaps by years of shouting orders over cannon fire. "Do not let me interrupt you. This is as much your library as anyone's." I did not know what to make of that statement. I clutched the book I had retrieved and made to move past him toward the door, but he stepped slightly to block my path, not threatening but deliberate. "Forgive me," he said, and now I could see his face more clearly in the morning light streaming through the tall windows. "I am trying to remember where I know you from. We have met before, surely." "I am Catherine," I said quietly, keeping my eyes somewhere near his collar rather than meeting his gaze. "I have lived here since I was a child. You would have seen me about the house, I expect, before you left for the army." "Catherine," he repeated, as though testing the name. "Yes, I remember now, though you were much younger then. You used to watch from the gallery when we had parties." I felt shame heat my skin at this acknowledgement that he had noticed me in my watching, that my surveillance had been witnessed and remembered. "I apologize if I gave offense," I said. "I did not mean to intrude upon the family's privacy." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Intrude," he said, "as if you were not as much a part of this house as any of us. More, perhaps, in some ways." I did not understand what he meant by that, and did not dare to ask. Instead, I stood there, clutching my book, feeling the weight of his attention like something physical. "My mother tells me you help her with her correspondence," he said after a moment, "that you read to her when her eyes trouble her, that you have made yourself useful." "I try to earn my place," I said, and heard the defensiveness in my voice before I could suppress it. His expression changed then, something softening in his eyes. "That must be exhausting," he said quietly, "to spend every day earning what others take as their birthright." I did not know how to respond to that. No one had ever acknowledged the particular burden of my existence here, the constant calculation of worthiness, the unending vigilance required to maintain my tenuous position. Hearing it spoken aloud by this man who barely knew me felt both validating and dangerous, as though he had seen something I had tried to keep hidden. "We all have our duties," I managed to say, though my voice came out less steady than I intended. He studied me for another long moment, and I forced myself to meet his gaze, to not look away like a frightened child. His eyes were very dark, almost black in the library's shadows, and there was an intelligence in them that unsettled me, a sense that he saw more than I wanted to reveal. "I suppose we do," he said finally, stepping aside to let me pass. "Perhaps we might speak again sometime. I find I am curious about the person who knows my childhood home better than I do myself." I murmured something non-committal and fled, my heart hammering in my chest in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I went to my room and sat on my narrow bed, staring at the book I still held, trying to understand what had just happened and why I felt so shaken by a simple conversation. Over the following weeks, I found myself encountering Captain Thornfield with a frequency that seemed beyond mere chance. He appeared in the garden when I was cutting flowers, in the music room when I was practicing the pianoforte in the hours I knew the family to be occupied elsewhere, in the halls when I was going about my small tasks. Each time he would pause and speak with me, asking questions about the house, about my reading, about my days. The conversations were brief, always careful, but there was an intensity to his attention that I had never experienced before. I began to live for these encounters even as they terrified me. I found myself choosing my dresses more carefully in the mornings, arranging my hair with more attention, hoping and dreading in equal measure that I might see him. It was dangerous, I knew, to invest any meaning in his courtesy. He was simply being kind to someone he saw as a dependent of his family, nothing more. And yet I could not help but notice the way his gaze would linger on my face when I spoke, the way he listened as though my opinions mattered, the way he sometimes smiled at something I said with genuine pleasure. Lady Thornfield, if she noticed these interactions, said nothing. But I began to catch her watching me with an expression I could not quite interpret, something between concern and calculation. Once, when I was reading to her in the afternoon and paused to rest my voice, she asked abruptly if I found her son much changed by the war. I said I could not say, as I barely remembered him from before. This was not quite true, but it seemed the safer answer. She made a humming sound that might have been satisfaction or displeasure, and we returned to our reading. It was nearly Christmas when the first real crack appeared in the careful architecture of my existence. The family was hosting a small dinner, and I was helping to arrange the place settings in the dining room when Captain Thornfield entered. I made to leave, but he called me back. "Stay a moment," he said. "I wanted to ask you something." I waited, my hands clasped in front of me, trying to embody the perfect posture of grateful servitude I had spent years cultivating. "How old are you, Catherine?" he asked. "I am 22, sir," I said, confused by the question. "And you have lived here all your life?" he said. It was not a question. "Since I was an infant, yes." He walked slowly around the table, not looking at me directly, but at the carefully laid silver and china, touching a wine glass here, straightening a napkin there. "My mother has always been vague about your origins," he said. "Whenever I ask, she changes the subject." My heart began to beat faster. "I am told my mother was a seamstress who died in childbirth," I said, repeating the story I had been given. "That your mother took me in out of Christian charity." He stopped moving and turned to face me fully. "And you believe that?" he said. "I have no reason not to," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I felt their hollowness. I had never questioned the story, but neither had I ever quite believed it, not in the deepest part of myself, where truth resides. "No reason," he repeated. "Even though you have been educated as a gentlewoman, given accomplishments far beyond what would be needed for a servant or dependent. Even though my mother keeps you close but never speaks of you to society. Even though there is a portrait in the locked study that could be your twin." The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. "A portrait," I whispered. "What portrait?" But before he could answer, Lady Thornfield entered the room, and the expression on her face when she saw us together, when she read the intensity of the moment, made my blood run cold. She looked at her son with something I had never seen in her before, something like fear mixed with fury. "James," she said, and her voice was iron. "A word in the study, if you please." He held my gaze for another moment, and I saw apology there, and determination. Then he followed his mother from the room, and I stood alone amid the glittering table settings, my hands trembling, my mind racing with questions I had never dared to ask, and answers I suddenly, desperately needed to know. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in my narrow bed and thought about locked studies and portraits, and the way Lady Thornfield had looked at me, at her son, at the space between us. I thought about all the small peculiarities of my situation that I had accepted without question, because I had no framework for understanding them differently. I thought about Captain Thornfield's words, the suggestion implicit in them that my story, my identity, might be something other than what I had been told. When morning came, I was no closer to understanding, but I had made a decision. I would find that portrait. I would see for myself what resemblance Captain Thornfield believed he saw. And perhaps then I would know whether the questions that had begun to bloom in my mind were mere fantasy or the first stirrings of a truth that had been kept from me all my life. I only had to find the courage to look and the opportunity to act before Lady Thornfield locked away whatever secrets that study might hold even more tightly than before. The study had always been forbidden to me, though not explicitly. It was simply one of those rooms I understood to be beyond my reach, like so many spaces in the manor that belonged to the family in ways I could never claim. Lord Thornfield used it for his business affairs, and after his death 3 years prior, Lady Thornfield had locked it and kept the key on a chain at her waist alongside her household keys. I had 3 days to wait before opportunity presented itself. 3 days of performing my usual duties while my mind churned with questions. 3 days of avoiding Captain Thornfield's searching looks across the breakfast room when I delivered Lady Thornfield's morning correspondence. 3 days of lying awake at night, imagining what that portrait might reveal. On the 4th day, Lady Thornfield received word that her sister in Bath had taken ill and required her immediate presence. I watched from the morning room window as her traveling coach was prepared, as her maid carried down the hastily packed trunks. She called me to her before departing, and I stood before her in the entrance hall, my hands folded, my expression carefully neutral. "I shall be gone a fortnight at least," she said, studying my face with that penetrating gaze I had learned to endure without flinching. "Mrs. Hartley will manage the household in my absence. You will continue your usual duties and conduct yourself with propriety. Is that understood?" "Yes, my lady," I said. She hesitated then, her hand moving to the keychain at her waist. For a moment I thought she might say something more, but she only nodded curtly and swept out to her waiting carriage. I watched until it disappeared down the drive, and only then did I allow myself to breathe fully. Captain Thornfield found me in the library that afternoon. I was pretending to read, though I had been staring at the same page for the better part of an hour, my mind too restless to absorb the words. "She has gone, then," he said from the doorway. I looked up, my heart beginning its now familiar acceleration at the sight of him. "Yes, sir. Her sister is unwell." He came into the room, and I noticed he carried a small iron key in his hand. "The study is unlocked," he said quietly. "If you wish to see the portrait I mentioned, now would be the time." I stared at him, understanding and alarm warring in my chest. "You took the key," I said. "I made an impression in wax while she slept," he said. "Had a copy made in the village." His expression was serious, almost grim. "I need to know the truth, Catherine, and I believe you do as well." "This is dangerous," I whispered. "If she discovers what you have done." "Let me worry about my mother," he said. "The question is whether you have the courage to face whatever that room might contain." I set down my book with hands that trembled only slightly. I rose and smoothed my skirts, buying myself a moment to steady my breathing. Then I met his eyes and nodded. The study was at the end of the west wing, past the formal drawing rooms and the music room, in a corridor that grew darker and colder the farther one walked from the inhabited parts of the house. Captain Thornfield walked ahead of me, and I followed, my footsteps soundless on the runner carpet. My heart beat so hard I thought he must hear it. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room beyond was dim, curtains drawn against the afternoon light, and it smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco and something else, something like dried flowers and regret. He crossed to the windows and pulled back the heavy drapes, and pale winter sunlight flooded the space. It was a gentleman's study, lined with books and ledgers, dominated by a large mahogany desk. But what drew my eye immediately was the portrait hanging above the mantelpiece. Captain Thornfield had not exaggerated. The woman in the painting could have been my mirror image. She was young, perhaps 20, with dark hair arranged in the style of 30 years past, but her face was my face, the same wide-set eyes, the same determined chin, the same slight asymmetry to the mouth. She wore a pale blue gown and held a single white rose, and she looked out from the canvas with an expression of such sadness that it made my chest ache. "Who is she?" I whispered. Captain Thornfield stood beside me, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle. "Her name was Eleanor Ashford. She was my father's ward, much as you have been my mother's. She lived here from the age of 16 until she disappeared when she was 23. "Disappeared," I repeated, unable to look away from that painted face. "The official story was that she eloped with an unsuitable man, a merchant's son from the village. There was a scandal, naturally. My mother insisted the family cut all ties with her, refuse any communication. My father complied, though I remember even as a child sensing his reluctance. And then, a year later, we received word that Eleanor had died of fever in London. But you do not believe that story," I said. He moved to the desk and began opening drawers. My father kept meticulous records. After he died, my mother locked this room immediately. She said she could not bear to sort through his things, that I should do it when I returned from the war, but I think she feared what I might find. He pulled out a wooden box from the bottom drawer, beautifully inlaid but dusty from years of neglect. He set it on the desk and opened it, revealing stacks of letters tied with ribbon, a lock of dark hair, and a small leather journal. "I found these last night," he said. "I could not sleep after my mother departed, so I came here and searched. Catherine, These letters are from Eleanor. They are dated months after she supposedly eloped, and they tell a very different story. He handed me one of the letters, and I took it with shaking hands. The paper was old, yellowed, but the ink was still legible. I read words that made the room spin around me. "Dearest Thomas," it began, and I realized she was writing to Captain Thornfield's father. "I write to you once more, though you have not answered my previous letters. I understand your silence. I understand that Lady Margaret has forbidden any contact, that you must honor your wife's wishes above all else. But I beg you to know that the child thrives. She is healthy and beautiful, and she has your eyes. The midwife who attended the birth has found me a situation as a seamstress, and I work when I can, but it is difficult with an infant to care for. I do not ask for money, though we have little. I ask only that you might see her once, that you might know your daughter before I must give her up to those who can better provide for her." The letter fell from my hands. I looked at Captain Thornfield, then back at the portrait, then at the letter lying on the floor between us. "Eleanor was my mother," I said. "Your father was my father." The words felt impossible even as I spoke them, too large to contain, too dangerous to be real. Captain Thornfield's face was grave. "There are a dozen letters here, all variations on the same plea. She was desperate. She loved him, I think, or believed she did. He had been kind to her when she was a ward in this house, and that kindness had led to more. When she found herself with child, she went to him in secret. He gave her money and arranged for her to go to London, away from the scandal. But my mother discovered the truth, and she forbade any further contact," I said, understanding beginning to dawn with horrible clarity. "She did more than that." He picked up the journal and opened it to a marked page. "This is my father's private diary. He writes of Eleanor's death, but there is guilt here, Catherine. Guilt and something else. He writes that my mother insisted Eleanor must be forgotten, that the child must never know, that if the truth emerged, it would destroy the family's reputation. And then he writes something that suggests Eleanor did not die of fever at all. He showed me the entry, and I read words that made my blood run cold. The physician confirms what I feared. The dose was too strong. She did not suffer long. Margaret assures me it was necessary, that Eleanor would have exposed us, destroyed James's prospects, ruined everything we have built. I must believe this was the only way. I must believe the child will be better off never knowing the shame of her origins. God forgive me for what I have allowed. I could not breathe. The room seemed to close in around me, the portrait of my mother watching with those sad, knowing eyes. Lady Thornfield had murdered her, had murdered my mother to keep a secret, to protect the family name, to ensure that I would never know the truth of my birth. And then she brought me here, I whispered, raised me under her own roof. Why? Why would she do that? Guilt, perhaps, Captain Thornfield said quietly, or control. If you were here, she could ensure you never learned the truth, never made claims on the family, never became a threat. She could shape you into someone grateful and docile, someone who would never question or challenge. I thought I might be sick. All these years I had lived with my mother's murderer, had served her, had tried so desperately to earn her approval and affection. All these years I had been told I should be grateful, and I had believed it. Catherine, Captain Thornfield said, and his hand touched my shoulder, gentle and steadying. I am so deeply sorry. I suspected something was wrong, but I did not imagine this. I pulled away from his touch, needing space, needing air. I walked to the window and stared out at the gray garden, the bare trees, the iron sky. Inside me, something was breaking apart and reforming, a lifetime of carefully constructed identity, shattering and revealing something raw and true beneath. I am not who I thought I was, I said. I am not a charity case. I am not an orphan grateful for scraps of kindness. I am the daughter of Thomas Thornfield. I am legitimate claim to this house, to this name. You are my half-sister, he said, and there was something strange in his voice. I turned to look at him, and the expression on his face was complex, difficult to read. Yes, I said, we share a father. We are blood. He looked away, his jaw tight. Yes, he said, we are blood. There was a long silence. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. I thought about my mother, young and desperate, writing letters that were never answered. I thought about Lady Thornfield, cold and controlled, deciding that murder was preferable to scandal. I thought about the little girl I had been, raised in shadows, taught to be grateful for the poisoned gift of her existence. What do I do now? I asked. What am I meant to do with this knowledge? Captain Thornfield turned back to me, and I saw resolve settling over his features. You could expose her, he said. These letters, this diary, they are evidence. You could go to the authorities, bring charges. You could claim your rightful place as Thomas Thornfield's daughter. But, I said, hearing the hesitation in his voice, but it would destroy what remains of this family, he said. My mother would hang for murder. The scandal would be catastrophic. And you, he paused, you would be known as the illegitimate daughter whose mother was murdered by her father's wife. Society would devour you. So I should remain silent, I said bitterly. I should continue as I have been, grateful and quiet, pretending ignorance. I do not say that, he said. I only warn you of the cost of truth. You have a right to be angry, Catherine. You have a right to justice, but you must know what justice will require of you. I looked again at my mother's portrait, at that sad, lovely face. She had loved unwisely and paid the ultimate price. What would she want for me, I wondered? Vengeance or safety? Truth or survival? I need time, I said. I need time to think about this. Of course, he said. But Catherine, you must be careful. If my mother suspects you know, if she thinks you pose a threat, I cannot predict what she might do. The implication was clear and chilling. Lady Thornfield had killed once to protect her secrets. There was no reason to believe she would not kill again. I will be careful, I said, and I will tell no one what we have discovered here. He nodded and began to carefully replace the letters and journal in their box. I watched him, this man who was my half-brother, and felt the complicated tangle of emotions his presence now evoked. He had shown me truth when he could have kept silent. He had given me the key to my own history. But in doing so, he had also irrevocably changed the nature of what had been growing between us. We were family. We shared blood. The feelings I had begun to develop, the warmth that spread through me when he entered a room, the way my thoughts turned constantly to him, all of it was now forbidden by more than mere class difference. It was forbidden by the deepest laws of morality and society. And yet, as I watched him lock the box away again, as our eyes met across the study, I knew that whatever had begun between us was not so easily dismissed. Truth had made us siblings, but it had not made us strangers. If anything, the shared knowledge of this terrible secret had bound us together in a way that felt more intimate than mere conversation ever had. This was the true danger, I realized. Not Lady Thornfield's potential violence, but the growing awareness that the man I was drawn to was the one man in the world I could never have. The days following our discovery in the study passed in a strange, suspended tension. I moved through my usual routines with mechanical precision, arranging flowers, reading to no one, cataloging books that needed no cataloging. But inside, I was transformed, as though I had shed an old skin and found beneath it something raw and unformed, something that did not yet know its own shape. Captain Thornfield and I barely spoke during this time, though I felt his presence like a weight in every room. When we passed in the corridors, our eyes would meet for the briefest moment before one of us looked away. When we sat at meals, him at the family table and me in my usual exile, I imagined I could feel his thoughts reaching toward me through the walls. The knowledge of our shared blood hung between us like an invisible cord, connecting and dividing us in equal measure. I spent hours alone in my room, staring at my reflection in the small mirror above my wash basin, searching for traces of the father I had never known. I had his eyes, the letters had said. Thomas Thornfield's eyes. I tried to remember the man from my childhood glimpses of him, tried to reconcile the distant figure who had passed me in hallways without acknowledgement with the man who had loved my mother enough to destroy her, because that was what he had done, in the end. His weakness, his inability to stand against his wife, had cost Eleanor her life. He had given her money and promises, and then he had allowed Lady Thornfield to silence her forever. The guilt in his diary suggested he had known, perhaps even suspected what his wife intended, and yet he had not stopped it. He had chosen his position, his reputation, his legitimate son over the woman who carried his child. I was the proof of his sin and his cowardice, raised under his roof like a ghost haunting the scene of her own erasure. The anger came in waves, hot and disorienting. I would be arranging linens or pouring tea and suddenly feel rage surge through me so powerfully that my hands shook. I wanted to scream at the portrait of Thomas Thornfield that hung in the formal drawing room, wanted to tear it from the wall and burn it. I wanted to stand before Lady Thornfield and speak the truth, watch her composed face crack with the knowledge that I knew, that her carefully constructed lie had crumbled. But I did neither. I held my silence and my rage, swallowed them down like bitter medicine, because I did not yet know what use I would make of this terrible knowledge. On the 6th evening after Lady Thornfield's departure, Captain Thornfield found me in the music room. I had been playing the pianoforte, working through a complex piece I had learned years ago, my fingers finding comfort in the familiar patterns. I did not hear him enter, and when I looked up to find him standing near the door, I startled badly enough that my hands crashed into a discordant chord. "Forgive me," he said. "I did not mean to frighten you." I collected myself and rose from the bench, smoothing my skirts in a gesture that had become automatic whenever I felt uncertain. "You did not frighten me," I lied. "I simply did not expect company." He came farther into the room, moving to the window that overlooked the darkening garden. "I have been thinking," he said without preamble, "about what you might do, about what options remain to you." I waited, my heart beginning its now constant acceleration in his presence. "You could leave," he said, still facing the window. "I could provide you with funds, help you establish yourself elsewhere. A new name, a new life. You could escape all of this." "And live as what?" I asked. "A woman alone with no references, no family, no history I could claim. You know as well as I that such a life would be little better than ruin." He turned to face me then, and I saw frustration in his expression. "Then what would you have me suggest, Catherine? You cannot stay here as you have been, not now that you know the truth, and you cannot confront my mother without destroying yourself in the process." "Perhaps I do not care about destroying myself," I said, and heard the edge in my voice. "Perhaps the truth is worth any price." "Do you truly believe that?" he asked, crossing the space between us until he stood close enough that I could see the shadows beneath his eyes, evidence of his own sleepless nights. "Or are you simply angry, as you have every right to be?" "I am angry," I admitted. "I am so angry I can barely contain it. But I am also afraid, and I am lost, and I do not know what person I am meant to be, now that everything I believed about myself has proven false." The words came out more raw than I intended, and I saw something shift in his face, a softening that made my chest ache. "You are the same person you were before," he said quietly. "Learning the truth of your birth does not change who you have made yourself to be, does it not?" I said. "I have spent my entire life trying to earn the love of a woman who murdered my mother. I have been grateful for scraps of attention from people who should have claimed me as family. I have made myself small and quiet and useful because I believed that was all I deserved. How can that person remain unchanged by knowing she was lied to, that she had worth and rights that were stolen from her?" He reached out as though to touch my arm, then seemed to think better of it and let his hand fall. "You are right," he said. "I spoke foolishly. Of course you are changed. How could you not be?" We stood in silence for a long moment, the space between us charged with all the things we could not say. I wanted to ask him what he felt, whether the knowledge of our shared blood had altered his perception of me as thoroughly as it had altered mine of him. I wanted to know if he too felt this terrible pull, this attraction that had nowhere to go and no acceptable resolution. But I asked none of these things, because to speak them would be to acknowledge what we both already knew and could not act upon. "My mother returns in 4 days," he said finally. "We must decide what to do before then." "What would you do?" I asked, "if you were in my position?" He considered this seriously, his brow furrowed in thought. "I think," he said slowly, "that I would want justice for my mother, but I think I would also want to survive. The question is whether there is a way to achieve both." An idea had been forming in my mind over the past days, fragile and frightening but growing stronger. "What if I were to leave?" I said. but not to disappear into anonymity. What if I were to claim a different kind of life, one that does not require revealing the truth, but that gives me independence and dignity? He looked at me sharply. What do you mean? I have been educated as a gentlewoman, I said. I can read and write, speak French, play the pianoforte. I could seek a position as a governess in another household, far from here. It would not be the life I might have had as your acknowledged sister, but it would be more than what I have now. It would be mine. I saw him wrestle with this, saw reluctance and relief war in his expression. It would mean you leaving Thornfield, he said. Leaving for good. Yes, I said simply. And you would be willing to do that, he asked. To walk away from any claim on this house, this family. What claim do I truly have? I asked. I am illegitimate. Even if I revealed everything, society would never accept me. I would be pitied at best, scorned at worst. No, I think leaving is the only real choice I have. The only question is whether I leave with some measure of control or whether I am eventually driven out when your mother senses I know too much. He moved away from me, pacing to the pianoforte and back. I hate this, he said, and there was genuine anguish in his voice. I hate that you should have to sacrifice anything more than you already have. You deserve so much better than this. We do not always receive what we deserve, I said. I learned that long ago. He stopped pacing and looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. If things were different, he began, then stopped. If circumstances were other than they are, but they are not, I said gently, sparing him the need to finish the thought. We are what we are, James. We are brother and sister, and there is no changing that. Hearing myself use his given name for the first time felt transgressive and intimate, and I saw him register it, saw color rise slightly in his face. Catherine, he said, and my name in his mouth felt like a confession. I need you to know that if I could change what we are to each other, if I could unmake the blood between us, I would do so without hesitation. The declaration hung in the air between us, dangerous and thrilling. I knew I should not respond, should not acknowledge what he was suggesting, but I found I could not help myself. I know, I whispered. I feel it too. For a long moment we simply looked at each other, and in that look was everything we could not have, every impossible future, every denied possibility. Then he turned sharply away, his hands clenched at his sides. You should go, he said, his voice rough. Before I do something we would both regret. I fled the music room and did not stop until I reached my own chamber. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart racing, my body trembling with the force of what had nearly happened, what could never happen. I had been right to plan my departure. Staying at Thornfield was not only dangerous because of Lady Thornfield's secrets, it was dangerous because of what I felt for James, because every day under the same roof was an invitation to disaster, to scandal of a different but equally destructive kind. That night, I began to write letters of inquiry to employment agencies in London, carefully crafting a history that was true enough to pass scrutiny but vague enough to conceal my connections to the Thornfield family. I would need references, and I spent hours composing what I hoped would pass as a letter from a former employer, practicing different hands until I had something that might be believable. It was dishonest, but I no longer had the luxury of perfect honesty. The truth of my birth was a weapon that could destroy everyone it touched, including myself. Better to build a new life on small lies than to tear down everything on a truth too terrible to speak. 3 days before Lady Thornfield's expected return, James came to me with a proposal. He had arranged for me to interview with a family in Surrey, friends of a fellow officer who knew nothing of my connection to the Thornfields. They needed a governess for their 2 young daughters, and the position came with respectable wages and a private room. I will tell my mother you requested leave to visit a dying aunt, he said, as we stood in the library, the only place we seemed able to speak privately. While you are gone, I will prepare her for the idea that you wish to seek a position elsewhere. I will make it seem as though you have outgrown your place here, that you wish for independence. She may even be relieved. And if I am offered the position, I asked, then you will write to say you are staying on, that you have found a situation that suits you. You will not return to Thornfield. His voice was carefully controlled, but I heard the pain beneath it. This was goodbye then. The final severing of whatever connection had grown between us. "Thank you," I said, "for arranging this, for helping me." "I wish I could do more," he said. "I wish I could give you everything you deserve, Catherine. Your name, your inheritance, your place in the world." "You have given me the truth," I said. "That is more than anyone else has done." The day I left Thornfield, the sky was heavy with unshed rain. James drove me to the station himself, and we sat in silence during the journey, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us like the clouds overhead. At the platform, as the train prepared to depart, he took my hand. His touch sent electricity through me, forbidden and perfect. "If you ever need anything," he said, "anything at all, you must write to me." "I will," I promised, knowing it was a lie. Once I left, I could not maintain contact without risking discovery, without prolonging the agony of wanting what I could never have. The train whistle blew, sharp and final. I pulled my hand from his and climbed aboard, finding my seat by the window. As the train began to move, I looked back and saw him standing on the platform, his figure growing smaller and smaller until the curve of the track took him from my sight entirely. I had escaped Thornfield with my life and my secret intact. I had chosen survival over justice, independence over truth. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like the deepest kind of loss. The Ashworth family welcomed me into their home with the kind of distant courtesy reserved for servants who were not quite servants. I was Miss Grey now, a name I had chosen for its plainness, its ability to fade into the background of any conversation. The two girls in my charge, Emily and Charlotte, were sweet-natured children of 8 and 10, and I threw myself into their education with a devotion that surprised even me. For 6 weeks I lived in this new existence, rising early to prepare lessons, spending long hours in the schoolroom teaching geography and French and piano, taking walks in the garden where I had no history, no ghosts. I ate my meals alone in my room and read by candlelight until my eyes grew heavy. I did not think about Thornfield. I did not think about James. I told myself this was my life now, and if it was lonelier than I had imagined, well, loneliness was a small price to pay for safety. But at night, when sleep would not come, I would stand at my window and look out at the unfamiliar landscape, and I would remember the way his hand had felt in mine on the train platform. I would remember the look in his eyes when he said he wished he could unmake the blood between us. I would press my palm against the cold glass and wonder if he thought of me, if he stood at windows in Thornfield and felt this same hollow ache. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late February. I recognized James's hand immediately, though he had signed it only with his initials. My hands trembled as I broke the seal, even as I told myself I should not have opened it, should have burned it unread. The words were brief and carefully composed, written as though to a distant acquaintance rather than the woman he had confessed feeling for. He wrote that Lady Thornfield had returned from Bath in poor health, that the physicians were concerned, that she had been asking for me in her fevered state. He wrote that if I could find it in myself to return, even briefly, it might bring her comfort in what could be her final days. I read the letter 3 times, searching for hidden meaning in the formal phrases. Was this truly about Lady Thornfield's illness, or was it an excuse, a way to bring me back? And if I returned, what would I find? The woman who had murdered my mother, now weakened and perhaps dying. The house that had been my prison and my home. The man I could never have, waiting in those familiar rooms. I should have refused. I should have written back with polite regrets, citing my duties to the Ashworth children. But even as I thought this, I was already composing a request for leave, already imagining the journey back. Mrs. Ashworth granted me a week's absence with sympathetic understanding. A family obligation, I had said vaguely, and she had not pressed for details. 2 days later, I was on a train heading back to Thornfield, my heart beating an erratic rhythm against my ribs. James met me at the station. He looked thinner than I remembered, worn in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. When our eyes met across the platform, I saw relief flood his face, followed immediately by something more complicated. "Thank you for coming," he said, as he helped me into the carriage. "I was not certain you would." "How could I not?" I said, though I was not entirely sure which of us I had come for. "How is she?" "Dying," he said bluntly. "The physicians give her perhaps a week, perhaps less. She has been calling for you constantly, though she does not always seem to know who you are. Sometimes she calls you Catherine, and sometimes she calls you Eleanor." The name of my mother on Lady Thornfield's lips sent a chill through me. "Does she know that I know?" I asked. "I do not believe so," he said. "I think the fever has confused her memories, brought the past close to the surface. She speaks of things long buried, though not always coherently." The drive to Thornfield seemed both too long and too short. When the house came into view, gray and familiar against the winter sky, I felt something twist in my chest. I had thought I had escaped this place, but here I was, returning like a moth to a flame, drawn by ties I could not sever. Lady Thornfield's chamber was dim and stifling, heavy curtains drawn against the daylight, a fire burning too hot in the grate. She lay in the great bed, diminished by illness, her face waxen and her breathing labored. Mrs. Hartley sat beside her with a basin of water and cloths, and when she saw me, she rose with evident relief. "Miss Catherine," she said, and I heard genuine warmth in her voice. "Thank the Lord you have come. She has been so agitated, calling for you night and day." I approached the bed slowly, uncertain what I felt looking down at this woman who had shaped my entire existence through cruelty disguised as charity. In her weakened state, she looked almost pitiable, all her cold control stripped away by fever. Her eyes opened, unfocused and glassy. "Eleanor," she whispered. "Eleanor, you have come back." I glanced at James, who stood in the doorway, and he gave a slight shake of his head. "Play along," his expression seemed to say. "Give her what comfort you can." "I am here," I said quietly, sitting in the chair Mrs. Hartley had vacated. Her hand reached out, grasping mine with surprising strength. "I am sorry," she said, and tears began to leak from the corners of her eyes. "I am so sorry for what I did. He loved you, you know. Thomas loved you, but I could not bear it. I could not bear to be second in his heart." I sat frozen, listening to this confession I had never expected to hear. "The child," she continued, her voice growing more agitated. "What became of the child? Did she live? Did you give her away as I told you to?" "She lives," I heard myself say. "She is safe." "Good," Lady Thornfield said, her grip on my hand loosening slightly. "Good. That is good. Tell her. Tell her I did not mean for it to end as it did. The physician said it would only make you sleep, that you would wake and be reasonable. But you did not wake, Eleanor. You did not wake, and I thought I would go mad with the guilt of it." I felt James's presence behind me, felt his hand on my shoulder, steadying. The truth was pouring out of his mother in her delirium, confession mixed with justification. And I did not know whether to feel vindicated or sickened. Over the next 3 days, I sat with her often, listening as she wandered between past and present, between memory and fever dream. She spoke of her marriage to Thomas, arranged when she was 17 to a man 20 years her senior. She spoke of her loneliness, her gradual realization that her husband's affections lay elsewhere. She spoke of the rage that had consumed her when she discovered Eleanor was with child, the betrayal that had driven her to unthinkable action. And she spoke, in fragmented pieces, of a secret I had not known. In one of her more lucid moments, she grasped my hand and pulled me close. "The letters," she said urgently, "in the blue box in my dressing room. Read them. You must read them and know the truth." "What truth?" I asked. But she had slipped back into delirium, calling again for Eleanor, for Thomas, for forgiveness that I could not grant. That evening, when she was sleeping fitfully and the house was quiet, I found the blue box she had mentioned. It was small, lacquered, sitting on her dressing table as though she had been looking at it recently. Inside were 3 letters, old and carefully preserved. James found me sitting on the floor of his mother's dressing room, the letters spread around me, tears streaming down my face. "Catherine," he said, dropping to his knees beside me. "What is it? What have you found?" I handed him the first letter, unable to speak. I watched as he read, as understanding dawned across his features. The letter was from a physician in London, dated 2 months before my birth. It confirmed that Eleanor Ashford was indeed with child, but it also contained a detail that changed everything. The physician noted that based on Eleanor's account of her condition, The conception must have occurred in late March of the previous year. But Thomas Thornfield had been abroad from February through May that year, traveling on business matters. The dates did not align. The child could not be his. The second letter was from Eleanor herself, written to Lady Thornfield, not Thomas. In it, she confessed the truth. She had loved Thomas, had hoped he might return her feelings, but he had been kind to her only as a guardian, nothing more. The father of her child was a young man she had met in the village, a solicitor's clerk named William Gray. They had planned to marry, but he had died suddenly of influenza before she could tell him about the baby. She had been too ashamed to admit this truth, too afraid of being cast out without resources. So she had allowed Thomas to believe the child was his, had accepted his money and his guilty conscience, because it had seemed her only chance at survival. The third letter was Lady Thornfield's response, cold and brutal. She wrote that she knew Eleanor was lying, that the child must be Thomas's, whatever Eleanor now claimed. She wrote that Eleanor would go to London and give up the baby to an orphanage, and if she refused, Lady Thornfield would see her prosecuted for attempting to defraud the family. The letter ended with a threat thinly veiled as concern for Eleanor's welfare. "I am not Thomas's daughter," I said aloud, and the words felt both liberating and devastating. My father was William Gray. I am not a Thornfield at all. James stared at the letters as though they might transform before his eyes. "Then we are not," he began. "We are not siblings," I finished. "We share no blood. The barrier between us was built on a lie." He looked at me then, and in his eyes I saw the same dizzying realization that was crashing through me. Everything we had denied ourselves, everything we had believed impossible, had been based on a misunderstanding. Lady Thornfield had created the lie to justify her actions, and we had accepted it because the evidence had seemed so clear. "But if Eleanor told the truth in her final letter," I said slowly, "then why did Lady Thornfield still arrange her death? Why murder a woman who posed no real threat?" James picked up the third letter again, reading more carefully. "Because my mother never believed her," he said. "She convinced herself Eleanor was lying to protect Thomas, that the child was indeed his. Her jealousy and rage overrode any logic. She murdered an innocent woman because she could not accept that her husband might be blameless. The cruelty of it was staggering. My mother had died not even for an affair that had happened, but for one that existed only in Lady Thornfield's bitter imagination. And I had been raised as penance for a sin that had never been committed." We sat together on the floor of that dressing room, surrounded by letters that rewrote history, and I felt the world shift beneath me. I was not who I had thought I was 24 hours ago, but neither was I who I had thought I was 6 weeks ago. I was Catherine Gray, daughter of Eleanor Ashford and William Gray, born of love rather than scandal, robbed of both parents by circumstances and cruelty. And James was not my brother. He was simply a man who had shown me kindness, who had helped me discover truth, who had confessed feeling for me that I had believed could never be returned. "Catherine," he said quietly, and my name in his voice sounded different now, freed from the weight of forbidden desire. "I need to know what you want. Now that we know the truth, now that there is no impediment between us save the circumstances of your upbringing here. Tell me what you want." I looked at him, at this man who had risked his mother's wrath to give me the truth, who had helped me escape even knowing it would mean losing me. I thought about the life I had been building in Surrey, safe and small and lonely. I thought about the life I might have here, claiming no inheritance, but perhaps claiming something else, something I had believed impossible. "I want," I said carefully, "to know who I am before I can know what I want. I have been so many different people in so short a time. The grateful dependent, the wrong daughter, the escaped governess. I need to understand which of these is real before I can build anything lasting." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And my mother?" he asked. "What would you have me do about her?" "Let her die with her secrets," I said. "She has suffered enough with her conscience, if her fevered confessions are any measure. And pursuing justice now would only destroy what little good might yet come from this tragedy." 3 days later, Lady Thornfield passed quietly in the night. I sat with her at the end, holding the hand of the woman who had killed my mother, and I whispered that Eleanor forgave her. It was a lie, but it was also a mercy, and I found I could grant her that much at least. The funeral was small and proper, and I stood beside James as a family friend, nothing more. But when the other mourners had departed and we stood alone in the winter garden, he took my hand. "When you are ready," he said, "when you know who you are and what you want. I will be here, Catherine. I will wait." I squeezed his hand and said nothing, because there were still too many unknowns, too many pieces of myself scattered across different lives. But for the first time since I had learned the truth, I felt something like hope. I returned to Surrey 3 days after the funeral, but I knew even as I boarded the train that my time as Miss Grey, governess, was drawing to a close. The Ashworth children welcomed me back with innocent affection, and I resumed my duties with outward calm, but inside I was still sorting through the pieces of myself, trying to assemble them into something coherent. I was Catherine Grey, daughter of Eleanor Ashford and William Grey. My mother had loved unwisely, but not immorally, had been guilty only of the vulnerability of her circumstances. My father had died before knowing I existed, before he could make Eleanor his wife and me his legitimate daughter. I had been orphaned by chance and misfortune, not by scandal. And I had been raised by a woman whose jealousy and pain had twisted into something monstrous, who had seen guilt where there was only innocence. The weight of this knowledge was different from what I had carried before. There was grief in it still, but also a strange kind of peace. I was not the product of sin. I was simply the child of two ordinary people who had loved each other and been denied their future together. That felt like something I could build a life upon. James wrote to me once a week, careful letters that spoke of estate business and weather and the small details of life at Thornfield. He never pressed me, never asked when I would return or what I had decided, but in the space between his words, I could read his patience, his steady presence, his willingness to wait as long as I needed. I found myself reading those letters over and over, tracing the familiar loops of his handwriting, imagining his voice, speaking the phrases. And slowly, carefully, I began to write back with more than polite responses. I wrote about the children I taught, about the books I was reading, about the questions I was asking myself. I wrote about identity and belonging, about the difference between the family we are born to and the family we choose. In his responses, he began to share more of himself as well. He wrote about his years at war, about the things he had seen that had changed him, about coming home to find the house and family he remembered transformed by time and secrets. He wrote about his own struggles with duty and desire, about the expectations placed upon him as the heir to Thornfield, and the life he might have chosen if circumstances had been different. Through these letters, we built something new between us, something not based on forbidden attraction or shared secrets, but on genuine understanding. We were becoming friends, and in that friendship I found the foundation for something that might, in time, become more. Spring came to Surrey with gentle insistence, and with it came clarity. One evening in late April, I sat in my small room and wrote a letter to the Ashworths, thanking them for their kindness and giving notice that I would be leaving their service at the end of the month. Then I wrote a second letter, this one to James. "I have spent these months trying to understand who I am apart from Thornfield," I wrote. "I needed to know that I could exist independently, that I had worth and purpose beyond the roles others had assigned me. I believe I have found that knowledge. I am a woman capable of supporting herself, of making her own choices, of claiming her own future. And having discovered this, I find that the future I want is one that includes you, if you are still willing to wait for me." His response came swiftly, arriving before I had even packed my belongings. "Come home," he wrote simply. "Come home to Thornfield, not as a dependent or a secret or a governess, but as yourself. Come home to me." The journey back felt different this time. I was not fleeing, and I was not being summoned. I was choosing, actively and deliberately, to return. When the familiar landscape came into view, when I saw the gray stone of Thornfield rising against the spring sky, I felt not the old dread, but something like recognition. This place had shaped me, for better and worse. It held my history, my ghosts, my beginnings. But it did not have to define my future unless I allowed it. James met me at the station, and when I stepped down from the train, he was there, his face breaking into a smile that transformed his usually serious expression into something warm and open. He did not embrace me, not there in public, but he took my hand and held it as though he would never let go. "Welcome home, Catherine," he said, and I heard in those words everything we had not yet spoken aloud. The house had been prepared for my return. A suite of rooms in the family wing had been opened and furnished, rooms that had belonged to no one in particular, and therefore carried no ghosts. Mrs. Hartley greeted me with genuine warmth, and I realized that the servants, at least, had always seen me more clearly than the family had. To them I had never been quite the charity case Lady Thornfield had insisted I was. That evening, James and I walked in the garden as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. We spoke of practical matters at first, the safe territory of estate business and household management. But eventually, the conversation turned to what mattered most. "I have been thinking," he said as we paused beside the old fountain, "about what comes next, for both of us." I waited, my heart beating faster despite the calm I tried to project. "Society will not easily accept you as my wife," he said bluntly. "You have no family to claim, no fortune, no position. There will be talk, speculation about who you are and where you came from. Some will assume the worst, and we will never be able to defend against those assumptions without revealing truths that would damage everyone." "I know," I said quietly. "I have thought about this as well. But James, I have spent my entire life worrying about what society thinks, about earning approval, about making myself acceptable. I find I no longer have the energy for that particular battle. If you are willing to face the gossip and the judgment, then so am I." He turned to face me fully, taking both my hands in his. "I am willing," he said, "more than willing. Catherine, I have waited my whole life without knowing I was waiting. I have done my duty, fulfilled every expectation, lived according to rules I never chose. You are the first thing I have ever wanted purely for myself. If you will have me, I will count all the rest as well lost." The words hung in the air between us, a declaration and a question. I looked at this man who had shown me truth when it would have been easier to maintain lies, who had helped me escape and then welcomed me back, who had waited while I found myself. I thought about the life we might build together, unconventional and perhaps complicated, but honest and chosen. "I will have you," I said, and felt something unlock in my chest, some final guard I had kept in place. "I will marry you, James Thornfield, and I will not apologize for choosing love over propriety." He pulled me close then, and when he kissed me, it felt like coming home and setting out on a journey at the same time. We stood together in that garden where I had played as a child, where I had cut flowers as a dependent, where I had walked in confusion and grief. But I was neither child nor dependent now. I was simply Catherine, and I had chosen this. We were married quietly a month later, with only Mrs. Hartley and a few close friends as witnesses. I wore a simple gown of cream silk and carried a bouquet of white roses, and when I spoke my vows, I meant every word. James gave me a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and I placed it on my finger, knowing that I was claiming not just a husband, but a place in the world, a name that was mine by choice rather than by birth or charity. The talk came, as we had known it would. Society speculated about my origins, invented scandalous histories, whispered about fortune hunters and social climbing. But we had expected this, and we faced it together. James made it clear that I was his wife and would be treated with the respect due to that position, and gradually, grudgingly, society accepted what it could not change. I made my own place at Thornfield, not by trying to become someone I was not, but by being useful in the ways that suited me. I took an interest in the tenants and their welfare, established a small school for the children of the estate workers, filled the library with new books, and opened it to anyone who wished to read. I was not Lady Thornfield, cold and formal and concerned only with appearances. I was simply Catherine, and that was enough. In the evenings, James and I would sit together in the study that had once been locked, the room where we had first discovered the terrible truth of my mother's death. We had removed the portrait of Eleanor and given it a place of honor in my private sitting room, where I could look at her face and remember that she had loved and been loved, that her brief life had mattered. The study we had transformed into a shared space, filling it with our books and our memories, with the things we chose together rather than the things we inherited. One night, nearly a year after our wedding, James found me standing at the window of that study, looking out at the darkened garden. He came to stand beside me, his arm around my waist, and we stood together in comfortable silence. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Choosing this life, this place, coming back?" I considered the question seriously, as it deserved. I thought about the life I might have had as Miss Grey, independent and solitary, building a quiet existence far from Thornfield and its ghosts. I thought about the other choices I might have made, the other futures I might have claimed. "No," I said finally, "I do not regret it. This place hurt me, yes, and it holds painful memories, but it also gave me you, and it taught me that I am stronger than I knew. I would not trade that knowledge for anything." He kissed the top of my head, a gesture that had become familiar and beloved. "You are the strongest person I know," he said. "You survived what would have broken others. You chose to live rather than merely exist, and you gave me the privilege of witnessing that choice, of being part of it. We are both choosing," I said, "every day. That is what makes it real." Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour. I thought about my mother, who had died too young and too afraid, who had never known that her daughter would survive and even thrive. I thought about Lady Thornfield, twisted by jealousy into something monstrous, who had died with her secrets eating her alive. I thought about all the women who had lived in these rooms before me, who had made their own choices or had choices made for them, who had loved and lost and endured. I was part of that lineage, but I was also something new. I was Catherine Thornfield, born Catherine Grey, raised in silence but refusing to remain silent. I had claimed my voice, my story, my right to love and be loved without shame or secrecy. The secrets of Thornfield Manor had been buried for so long, but I had unearthed them and survived the truth. And in surviving, I had found not just answers, but something far more precious: the freedom to write my own ending, to choose my own family, to build a life based not on lies and silence, but on honesty and love. This was my home now, not because I had been born to it or because someone had taken pity on me, but because I had chosen it. And that choice, hard-won and deliberate, made all the difference. I turned from the window and faced my husband, this man I had once believed I could never have, and I smiled. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever challenges or joys or sorrows, we would face them together. Not as keeper and dependent, not as lady and governess, but as equals who had found each other through darkness and chosen to walk toward light. The past would always be part of me, but it would not define me. I was Catherine Thornfield, and my story was just beginning.